Hello, welcome to another GCSE History exam technique presentation on the CHSG History channel. We're going to look at narrative questions in this presentation, focusing on paper 2, and our content's going to be détente. Okay, so here's the question we're going to work on today. It comes from the 2018 paper 2 and it's question 2. Write a narrative account is how our question will start. And for us today, it's analysing the key events of détente in the 1970s. And then you can see we have two pieces of stimulus material to work from. Those are quite important for these questions. We're going to do something quite specific with those. So just be aware that it's going to be SALT 1 in 1972 and Afghanistan in 1979. These types of questions only appear on paper 2. Just make yourself aware at the moment that what our examiners are after too is for us to show knowledge and understanding of key events, and also is looking for us to explain and analyse key events too. In the course of doing this, we're going to need to link those events and developments together. So showing how events link up is key, as is the sequence that things happened in, but again we'll work on that as we go through things. So before we tackle our question, let's have a look at some reasons for détente. We'll take 3. Firstly, America was hoping to end the Vietnam War and was also hoping that the Soviet Union would help them to do this. So better relations with the USSR would lead to the end of a costly and disastrous war in Vietnam that they were desperate to finish. On the Soviet side, Brezhnev wanted to raise living standards. They were still stubbornly low, and so he was looking to get hold of American technology and imports of food to help him to raise living standards. So better relations would suit him too. And thirdly, both superpowers were struggling economically to keep up with the massive spending on the arms race. It was astronomical by the start of the 1970s. Particularly the Soviet Union couldn't afford this, but America was also feeling the strain of the huge amounts of money they were spending too. So let's have a look at some of the key features of détente. There are 3 that we'll look at. Firstly, arms control treaties and agreements. There are 3 major ones, and we will unpack these more in a moment, but we're going to make ourselves aware of SALT 1 in 1972, Helsinki in 1975, and SALT 2 in 1979. We will go over those in slightly more detail in a moment or so, but just before we get there, let's make ourselves aware that this was also a period of repeated summit meetings and visits between superpower leaders. For example, Nixon visited Moscow in 1972 and 1974. And it was also a time where the superpowers explored other links with each other too. A nice example here is a link up in space between astronauts and cosmonauts in 1975. But there are also ties culturally and in sports too, just as part of a wider process of better relations. So let's have a look at the major treaties and agreements of the détente period. Firstly, SALT 1 in 1972. Now this served to slow down the arms race that had been gathering so much speed and was proving so expensive. We can look at 3 major areas of SALT 1. It placed a limit on anti-ballistic missiles, those are missiles that shoot down other missiles, and also put a freeze on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles. You can use all of those abbreviations in your work. The limitations in SALT 1 was that it didn't tackle multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. Those are missiles that split up into several different warheads, and also didn't place a limit on any heavy bombers. And secondly, the Helsinki agreements in 1975. Now this was a whole series of agreements signed by a range of world powers, not just the 2 superpowers. You might, when you read on this, find this agreement being spoken of in terms of things being split into baskets. We can look at 3 major baskets. That of security, and it was important that the USSR recognised formally West Germany. That increases European security. Secondly, cooperation. It developed a range of cultural and economic links. And thirdly, human rights, which would go on to become increasingly important in the Detente period and a source of friction, as the Americans weren't happy with some of the actions of the Soviets with regards to dissidents. But there was an agreement put in place to respect rights and individual freedoms. And lastly, SALT II in 1979, at the end of the Detente period. This went further than SALT I. It placed a limit on delivery vehicles, and there we're talking about how weapons are deployed, a limit to 2,400 on each side. It went further with MIRVs. It placed a limit on the multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles that we've just mentioned, and also placed a ban on any new launchers. But crucially, SALT II was never ratified by the US Senate. We'll have a look at why not in a moment. So this treaty is never enacted. Okay, and lastly, let's have a look at the reasons for the end of Detente in 1979. The images down the right hand side will give you an idea. Let's look at two others just quickly first. Firstly, the USA was becoming increasingly concerned again with Cuba. There had been a build-up of Soviet troops in Cuba that the Americans weren't happy with. Secondly, NATO had recently installed long-range missiles in Europe, and the Soviets were unhappy with that. But our major reason was that late in 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan in support of a communist government that was under threat from an Islamic rebellion by Mujahideen fighters. And to prop up this government, the Soviets launched a huge offensive, and America reacted furiously to this. And this effectively brought the period of Detente to a close, and was a direct reason why SALT II, that we've just spoken about previously, was never ratified. So this is a really important reason why Detente came to a close. Okay, so let's return to our question. There are some key features of a good answer that we're going to try to develop, and we'll discuss each of these. The extent of our answer is going to be to explain and analyse 3 events and developments, and we've been given 2 already that we can use. The stimulus material is slightly more important in these questions than in the other questions in the exam where you might be given a stimulus. We can really use these as signposts for the extent of our answer, for what the examiners would like us to talk about. And a third key feature is that we really need to link any of the events that we present together. A nice way of thinking about this might be thinking of how an event led to or contributed to the next factor or event that you're going to talk about. We'll explore each of these in a model answer. Before we get going on our model answer, let's just have a look at this little bit of feedback from the examiners. This is just worth pausing on for a moment or so. Try to ensure that your response shows a clear sequence of events, supported with accurate and relevant information. So again, what we're really after here is showing knowledge and understanding of 3 events and developments. We're going to need to link these together. And it's also worth remembering at this point that our stimulus materials are a good indication of where to start and also where to end our narrative. So before we get going on our answer, let's plan our paragraphs out. If possible, we're going to make our first paragraph about the first piece of stimulus material. If this is no good for you in the exam, if for example you can't remember SALT I, what you really need to do is to take another event or development from the start of the Detente period, but ideally we are going to use the first one. And what we're going to try to come up with is one of our points, evidence and explain paragraphs that's going to link into the next event that we're going to choose. So that's going to be the first paragraph that we're going to do. Our last paragraph is going to come from the second piece of stimulus material, for us Afghanistan in 1979. That's going to be one of our point, evidence and explain paragraphs. And that leaves us to come up with one event or development for ourselves, and we have to do this if we want to access top marks. There are several that we could go for. We might go for Helsinki, we might go for, I don't know, we might go for the Apollo-Soyuz link-up, but for us in our model answer, we're going to go for SALT II. So our 3 paragraphs are going to be SALT 1, SALT 2, and then Afghanistan in 1979. You might spot in those boxes there that in paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 we're going to need to link that paragraph to the next factor or event that's coming. So SALT 1 is going to link into SALT 2, SALT 2 is going to link into Afghanistan, but then Afghanistan of course isn't going to link into a further development because that's where our narrative is going to stop. Okay, so let's have a look at how our model answer is going to shape up. Our first paragraph is going to be on SALT 1 in 1972. Our structure is our usual structure, so we're going to start with a big point, and that's going to then lead us into an evidence and explain section. I've just pointed out where I've used a connective phrase. You don't need to worry too much if your evidence and explain becomes slightly mixed in this phase. That's okay, as long as we're discussing SALT 1 and how that tied into Detente. Now what's going to be distinct in these answers is going to be the final phase of these paragraphs, our link phrase. If you remember, we're going to need to try to get from SALT 1 to SALT 2 in 1979, and what we're looking to come up with here is one sentence or two at the most showing how SALT 1 either linked to or caused SALT 2 to happen. You might want to pause the presentation at this point and see if you can come up with your own before I give you my version. So you might just want to pause for a moment. Okay, let's have a look at mine. Here's what I've come up with. The terms of SALT 1 were quite limited, but the superpowers could build on it with a more ambitious treaty in 1979 called SALT 2. So you can see what I've tried to do there is I've just tried to show how there's a relationship between our two events, our two developments that we've got going on here. It doesn't have to be too detailed, but we're just going to try to tie them together. Okay, so let's have a look at paragraph 2. It's going to follow much the same structure. Big point, an evidence and explain phase, and if you remember this time, we're going to need to try to link SALT 2 to Afghanistan. Again, what you might want to do now is just pause the presentation at this point, maybe see if you can come up with your own before I show you what I've come up with again. Okay, so here's mine. However, SALT 2 was never ratified by the US Senate. USA was angry when the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and Detente came to an abrupt end. Again, I've not gone too far, I've not shown too much specific detail here, but I have shown a relationship between the two, and that again will lead our narrative forward into our final paragraph. Okay, our final paragraph is slightly more straightforward. Big point, an evidence and explain phase, and at this point of course we stop. There's nothing further for us to link to, so our answer finishes at the evidence and explain phase, and we're done at that point. So altogether we've come up with 3 paragraphs, no introduction, no conclusion, and we stop our answer there. Okay, we're nearly finished. You might want to take the techniques that we've looked at in our presentation a little bit further. If you do, here's a practice question for you to have a go at. We've structured it exactly the same way, so it's write a narrative account analysing the key events of Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership of the USSR up to 1991. You've got 2 pieces of stimulus material to have a go at. If you do want to have a go at this, then do try to stick to the structure that we've explored today. That's 3 paragraphs, remember, no introduction and no conclusion, crucially working on the links between paragraph 1 to 2 and then paragraph 2 to 3. Okay, we're at the end. Thanks for watching. You'll find other videos for you to have a look at with plenty of exam advice on the CHSG History channel.